And so this talk is called The Free Market One-State Solution to the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And so I will give a brief overview of Austrian economics. I'll talk about what that means. We'll talk a little bit about the rise and fall of socialism, as well as World War I, because that led a lot of bright people to do something really awful. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then number 3, we'll talk about 10 very popular anti-Semitic fallacies. We have to understand the fallacies that people make that lead to anti-Semitism, so then we can overcome it intellectually. And then I'm also going to talk about what I consider to be some of the errors of Zionism and some related fallacies that I think a lot of Zionists make. Then number 5, we'll talk about some modern anti-Semitism, like Candace, Dan Bilzerian, and that kind of stuff, to really see where we're at. And then we will talk about the solution and a lot of things that are involved with that. So Austrian economics, just like Galileo, really helped us understand some very important stuff, that the earth, goes around the sun instead of vice versa. These men are the economists that really explain how the economy works. Anybody who looks at the history of economics knows that these are the men that predicted that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. So these are really the thinkers that really explain how the economy works and how it evolved, how society and cultures evolve. So it's very important to really have a foundation on them. So I'm going to say a few key quotes and a few other key principles that serve as the intellectual foundation for where we're going and the ethos that we need to really make sense out of this. A few things about myself. My name is Jorge Besada. I'm usually a computer programmer, but once I stumbled upon the Austrians, I really got into Austrian economics. So this is my profile at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And now I am very much a Darwinian. Okay, here I am with Richard Dawkins, famous biologist, about 26 years ago. And there's a reason to this madness. And this is me also at the final resting place of 1974 Nobel laureate in economics, Friedrich Hayek, who is also one of these key evolutionary thinkers. And I do want to read this one quote from Hayek that says, "We understand now that all enduring structures above the level of the simplest atoms, up to the brain and society, are the result of and can be explained only in terms of processes of selective evolution." Now that's very key. When we look at animals and they do horrible things, we don't say that the animals are evil. We understand the complex evolutionary factors that lead to all kinds of things in the animal kingdom. Now we have to look at human beings the same way. We have to understand how the fallacies evolve, how the bad ideologies evolve, how the hatreds, how we're like this smarter tribalistic apes that can do horrible things. And we really want to have a deeper understanding, so that is key at this man. Now, very important, just a few key quotes from some of these major thinkers. So Ludwig von Mises is one of these major intellectuals, and I have a bust of him right here. And this sets the stage for how we really want to look at all these conflicts. So Mises tells us, "It is ideas that group men into fighting factions that press the weapons into their hands and that determine against whom and for whom the weapons shall be used. It is they alone and not arms that, in the last analysis, turn the scales." Again, we want to focus on the ideas. When somebody makes an anti-Semitic statement, they're making a fallacy. We don't just want to label them anti-Semites and throw them in jail. And it's the same thing, Jews, they feel maybe God gave them the whole land and they can do whatever they want. Again, people are just making errors, and we always want to focus on the fallacies instead of just the person, killing the person that's making the fallacies, right? So Mises had a great focus on that. Very important. Mises also tells us, "The problems involved are purely intellectual and must be dealt with as such, via reason, logic, education. It is disastrous to shift them to the moral sphere and to dispose of supporters of opposite ideologies by calling them villains. The rigid dogmatism peculiar to religious groups and to Marxism results only in irreconcilable conflict. It condemns beforehand all dissenters as evildoers. It calls into question their good faith. It asks them to surrender unconditionally. No social cooperation is possible where such an attitude prevails. No better is the propensity, very popular nowadays, to brand supporters of other ideologies as lunatics." Again, whether it was a battle between the socialist and the capitalist, the problems we have between the Zionist and the anti-Zionist, most people make the mistake of eventually saying these guys are evil or stupid. But that's not how we need to deal with things. We need to overcome the actual fallacies and never get into that sort of thinking. So again, a very key quote from Ludwig von Mises. Also, Mises, "Neither as judges allotting praise and blame, nor as avengers seeking out the guilty should we face the past. We seek truth, not guilt. We want to know how things came about to understand them, not to issue condemnations." Again, we want to have sympathy and understand how sometimes people, with the best of intention, fool themselves into errors. Mises again, "History should teach us to recognize causes and to understand driving forces. And when we understand everything, we will forgive everything." We have to understand, all the fallacies, and then we have forgiveness. Very important. Hayek now. "It is necessary to realize that the sources of many of the most harmful agents in this world are often not evil men, but high-minded idealists, and that in particular the foundations of totalitarian barbarism have been laid by honorable and well-meaning scholars who never recognize the offspring they produce." Karl Marx and a lot of ideologues, the Nazis had their ideologues who really believed in their racial theories and so on. So a lot of the bad stuff is lots of bright people fooling themselves into major disasters. And this is the perfect example. Albert Einstein, obviously a very smart man, critical of a lot of what some of the early Zionists were doing, courageous, But he made a mistake. He felt in 1949, he wrote a very famous paper called Why Socialism, which to me is a perfect example of how really bright people can fool themselves into a bad ideology. So he says, the real purpose of socialism is precisely to overcome and advance beyond the predatory phase of human development. It's a massive fallacy, and hopefully we'll get to that soon. Hayek, one last time. Most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our time have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, or Stalin appealed only to the worst instincts of their people. They also appealed to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. Okay, everybody falls for disastrous ideas. Now, very quickly, so this is a famous quote from Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, where he says, the theory of the communist may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property, abolition of the family. Now, very quickly, from private property emerges the freedom to trade, your private property. And freedom to trade inadvertently turns the entire planet into a global supercomputer where every private sector business is motivated to innovate and to copy the innovations of competitors. Thus, inadvertently, cooperate in the creation and spread of superior or information throughout the entire social order. And that is what really creates progress. I have no idea. Maybe it was a Honda engineer working at Tokyo that came up with power door locks and power windows, but it was competition that motivated BMW in Germany, Chevy, Ford to copy the power windows and power door locks idea. Now, why is it that in the private sector, private companies have to innovate and copy each other's innovations? It is our freedom to trade our private property for what we consider to be best that motivates all of us in our role as producers to discover the best information. And we discover the best information by innovating ourselves or copying the innovations of competitors, right? So that is the mechanism that really creates civilization. Now, what's the problem with government? Government is a coercive, competition-immune order and bureaucracy that gets its wealth not by doing as well as competitors, but directly through taxation and acquiring wealth. So it's stagnant. It has no motivation to innovate and to copy innovations. And that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union and China were economically stagnant. Another very important thing about the government is that, for example, in the private sector, every order is coordinated in a manner where you're trying to be profitable. You're trying, every business has sales revenue. That is a measure of how much you have produced. And then there is costs, which is an estimate of how much wealth had to be consumed while production takes place. And everybody's trying to be profitable, right? You want to produce more than you consume, and you have a profit. So that means that you're growing the economic pie, and that is what led to civilization. We're always increasingly more productive. But the government doesn't have profit and loss calculation. The government just taxes. It takes wealth, it sucks resources, it provides something in exchange, but without profit and loss calculation, it always ends up consuming more than it produces. It's hard enough for us as business people in the private sector to be profitable. So just imagine the government without profit and loss calculation. So that is one of the reasons why the Soviet Union, once you do that, once you abolish the private sector, now you don't have any innovation, you don't have economic calculation, and you just consume more wealth than you produce, and you have famines and total chaos and so on. So that's pretty much all I'm going to be saying about economics. No, one more thing. What is a regulation, right? Regulations are just information that is not subject to competition, right? And in the private sector, information is always arising. People are copying it. They're adapting it to their local needs. But regulation is just information that comes from the top. It gets coerced upon everyone, and you can only change it through lawyers, people that don't have the right incentives. And that's why here we can clearly see, there's a great chart showing that the more regulated, the more paralyzed an industry is. So you have less progress. Everything gets more expensive. Compare something like the medical industry, right? Where it's all regulations, where to learn how to be a doctor. The AMA dictates all of those things. Compare that to the IT sector. You have teenagers that work at Microsoft and Google. They don't even have degrees. Technology is constantly changing. How many JavaScript libraries do we have? Now we have all the AI stuff. So it all happens thanks to pure competition. That's why the IT sector grows so fast, while the healthcare sector is just totally paralyzed. In 1960, the healthcare sector only consumed about 5% of the economy. By now, it consumes about 20% of the economy, and it's just, destroying America. So, okay, that's all about economics. Now, Mises, again. All civilizations have up to now been based on private ownership of the means of production. In the past, civilization and private ownership have been linked together. If history could teach us anything, it would be that private property is inextricably linked with civilization. So these are the guys that got it right. Unfortunately, the masses fool themselves with socialism. Mises, almost one last time. All reasonable men are called upon to familiarize themselves with the teachings of economics. This is, in our age, the primary civic duty. If more people understood this and we changed minds, we wouldn't have had the socialist calamity. One more. Liberalism is rationalistic. It maintains that it is possible to convince the immense majority. It has full confidence in man's reason. It may be that this optimism is unfounded and that the liberals have earth, but then there is no hope left for mankind's future, right? If we do not even have enough people who believe that we can educate others, we're not even going to try, and we're just going to self-mutilate. And the very last one, I promise, you can never have too many Mises quotes. History speaks only to those people who know how to interpret it on the ground of correct theories. The Nazis had their racial theories, why the white man was all that. The communists had their class analysis bullshit, but it was the Austrians who really understood how as private property increased and freedom increased, we got modern civilization. Now, very quickly, we're done with the economics piece, and we already talked about communism. Let's look at the First World War. I encourage people to read this article I wrote for the Mises Institute. During the First World War, Europe's finest, for 4 years, the theologians, the politicians, the masses, the engineers, the doctors, they fooled themselves into believing that they needed to send their youth to run across the trenches for 4 years, slaughtering each other, for reasons today not one out of 100,000 people know anything about or care, and so on. So that is another great example of how the masses can fool themselves into just a total tyranny. And today, every historian today will look back at history and they will tell you that the German Kaiser Wilhelm, he had no desire to conquer Europe or any of this nonsense. So it's very important to understand how we can fool ourselves with disaster. Also, something very important from the First World War, the Germans were portrayed not as fellow Homo sapiens, they were portrayed as this evil bestial Huns who would on purpose bayonet Belgian babies and chop off their hands. And this was such a big deal that John T. Scopes, a famous lawyer in the United States who was involved in the Scopes monkey trial about teaching evolution in schools, this man went to France in 1916, specifically looking for evidence of this Belgian children that had their arms amputated. And of course, he couldn't find any. So it is very important that we work ourselves up. We're all equally Homo sapiens, but some people are the evil terrorists, or the satanic Jews, and it's important that we have a beacon that can overcome these fallacies. Now, this is another one. This is a Japanese lady, a Japanese American from Bainbridge Island, the United States. Soon after we, the good people, got into Second World War, we rounded up the Japanese and we also put them in concentration camps as well because they were, the evildoers who would sabotage things and that kind of stuff. So, and the final quote, this is related to economics. This is Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. If you look at the cells in your body, right, over 2 million years, the cells in your body, inadvertently, they acted and they created the respiratory, the digestive, the nervous systems that eventually allowed multicellular organisms to cooperate. It's obvious that it was done by the cells in a slow evolutionary process, but the cells did not design all of those systems, right? Well, the same thing happens to society and the economy. Things like money, language is another great example of something that is the result of the actions of people, but was not designed by people, right? No smart caveman one day said, oh, I'm going to invent language so we can communicate better. It's something that slowly evolved. Well, the economy, how some of these horrible ideologies spread, our religions, our own identities. These things, right? Social phenomena and institutions, to quote Menger, they do not prove to be the result of an intention aimed at this purpose, but is the unintended product of historical development. We want to understand how all of this sort of evolved, and Karl Menger was the key badass at getting all this stuff going. So that's all about economics, okay? So now let's quickly look at the major anti-Jewish fallacies, right? We're gonna overcome this chaos. We have to understand why we have anti-Semitic fallacies. So I'm just gonna tell them, I'll go with them very quickly. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with them. So number one, misunderstanding ethnic Jewish overrepresentation in finance and banking. The Islamic world and the Roman Catholic Church, for many centuries, they thought charging interest on loans was immoral. So they essentially banned money lending for Christians and Muslims, inadvertently turning over the entire industry to Jews. So now Jews who find themselves at 0.5 or maybe 1% of the Western world population are given all of the savings of the Western world for them, to manage, to be the middleman and that kind of stuff. So that inadvertently would give Jews an immense influence and power. Now, it's very important to recognize the benefits of finance and banking. How is an entrepreneur, going to borrow, suddenly get a lot of money to create a factory or a skyscraper or a big building if you're limited by the savings of friends and family? It's great that you have finance and banking where people are motivated to consume less, give their money to the banks, so then the banks can lend it to people who have good ideas that they will do the consumption, and they have to do something productive because they have to pay back the loan with interest. Right? So finance and banking and the phenomenon of interest rates, they motivate some people to save and thus not consume and to give their wealth to the people who have the better ideas so they can carry out their wonderful plans. And finance and banking is a great benefit to civilization. But economic ignorance and misinterpreting, religious scripture fooled for many centuries the Islamic world and the Christian world, to do that ban. And that is what led to the overrepresentation of Jews. Not some sinister plot, and any of those fallacies, but it's a very popular fallacy to call the Jews, usurers and that kind of stuff. The second one, very important, misunderstanding ethnic Jewish overrepresentation in the socialist communist movements and the disastrous Bolshevik Revolution. Why would Jews be overly represented in the Bolshevik calamity? Well, number one, if you're going to have an ideology that requires the better educated to coerce everyone else and make criminals out of them, the Jews were, on average, better educated in Russia. You had a higher percentage of people who could read and write and so on. Vladimir Jabotinsky, he famously, he boasts that for 70 generations, the Jews have been literate. So that's one of the inadvertent environmental factors that led Jews to be overly represented in this disastrous ideology. Also, you have the atheism. If you have been persecuted for religious reasons for so many centuries, it makes perfect sense that you're more likely to fall for an ideology where now, workers of the world unite. We're not going to have religious things, really, oppressing us like it used to happen. Also, very important, the Jews in Russia had it way worse than Jews outside. Russia still had draconian restrictions, on Jews. The Jews got equal treatment under the law in the United States from day one, France at the same year, in England in the 1850s, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1860s or something like that. Ludwig von Mises, right? He has the von because it's a nobility title. His grandfather was one of the first Jews to get the nobility title because the Austro-Hungarian Empire already gave equal rights to the Jews. Even in the Ottoman Empire, according to some of their major reforms in the 1860s, theoretically the Jews already got equal treatment under the law. But Russia, again, still had more draconian Christianity, more oppressive, which makes sense that you're going to fall for an ideology that wants to overthrow the old order. So again, those are three reasons, environmental factors that have nothing to do with some grandiose, conspiracy that the naive masses fall for, that led to the Jews being drastically overrepresented in the Bolshevik calamity. And again, the Jews suffer horribly, during the Bolshevik Revolution because the Red Army was led by Trotsky. And then the White Army, they saw everyone who was Jewish as somebody potentially collaborating with the Bolsheviks. So there were a lot of pogroms. They treated all the Jews, and a lot of them got slaughtered because of that. Most Jews were opposed to socialism. They wanted to remain who they were. Just because the leadership in the Bolshevik Revolution had a lot of Jews, it doesn't mean that it was some conspiracy by the Jews, and much less, with bad intentions. Okay, so that was an important one. Then number three, misunderstanding ethnic Jewish overrepresentation in things like pornography, LGBT stuff. I remember reading an article that said that Tel Aviv is like the gay capital of the world. Now, again, this happens because if Jews, on average, tend to be more secular and more Darwinian, it makes perfect sense that they're going to be more tolerant of human nature and things like that. So again, it has nothing to do, with anything in the Jews or anything like that. And I remember just a few days, some of you might recognize that the guy who invented OnlyFans, he recently died of cancer. And on Twitter, all the anti-Semites were like, well, this is what you deserve, to just create pornography and all that stuff. So again, we have to understand the root fallacies that lead, to this sort of stuff. Now, overrepresentation in Hollywood, Marlon Brando famously said, Hollywood is run by Jews, it's owned by Jews, for the same reasons, they're overly represented in an industry, where they were allowed to, and so on. Now, number five, ideological movements whose views deviated from established religious traditions. Candace Owens loved to talk about how Freud was Jewish and he came up with all the psychoanalysis and all these things and all this perversion and all that. It's again the same thing. It's just that if you're statistically more likely to have a culture that is more detached from our inherited religious norms that shuns up on those things, and you're more tolerant of the human animal, of the Homo sapiens, you're going to be overrepresented in all of these things. Again, it doesn't mean that the Jews plotted this whole thing for nefarious, and so on. Now, obviously, the religion influenced things like they killed Jesus and so on. Now, very important, according to obviously the New Testament and even standard Catholic theology, it is true that the New Testament says that some Jews were responsible for the death of Christ and so on. But even the Catholic Church says that, look, just because some Jews were responsible for the death of Christ, number one, that does not mean that all the Jews back in the past were responsible for this, and it has less of an influence of the Jews of today, right? So that is even the official Catholic teachings. But again, we understand the simple-minded people, the lowest common thinking just leads to, oh no, the Jews did this. So again, it's a very popular fallacy and so on. And again, calling the Jews satanic, for not converting to Christianity or whatever. And usurers, right? That's still, for a lot of Catholics and some people, they see them as usurers. They still think it's bad. So again, religion influenced fallacy. We don't understand the fallacies. Now, this is a very important one. Number 7, confusing the effect of shared ideology with nefarious conspiracy, right? George Carlin, the very famous critic, he said, this was awesome. He said, you don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge, right? So in an environment, you're going to have ideologies that spread through people's minds. Like as the social order was getting more complex, the idea of socialism, of course, the central planning, starting to spread more and more and more. And sooner or later, eventually you have financial incentives, and eventually people have the shared ideology, and then eventually they conspire based on the spread of these ideas. So that is what led to communism. It'd be foolish to think that Karl Marx was like the guy who invented communism. If you look at the history, those ideas were spreading, through time. And the same thing happens with something like Zionism. The Jews are rightly trying to look for solutions to anti-Semitism, and having your own state makes perfect sense. And little by little, those ideas keep spreading and spreading. And then, you have an incentive, and then people conspire to bring about things. But again, it's very important to realize we have to understand the complex evolution of the ideas that then eventually lead people to conspire. Sorry, but and we have to look at the ideas that then get people to conspire. It is the ideas that group man. Remember the Mises quote. So to just look at the conspirators and say, well, these are the good guys or the bad guys is a mistake. You still want to look at the evolution of the ideas. That's the point I want to make. And the same thing is happening with like Austrian economics, right? The ideas of Mises and these guys are spreading. We have the Ron Paul revolution here in the United States where people conspire to spread economics. The same thing happened with Argentina and Javier Milei. The ideas spread and the people conspire to bring about freedom. So that's what we need. We need a conspiracy of freedom. So that's it. Number 8. Misunderstanding ethnic Jewish overrepresentation or leadership in science, right? Especially when it goes wrong. A lot of people would love to say that Albert Bourla, right, the CEO of Pfizer, right? I'm one of the people who feels like the whole COVID mania was just bad science gone wrong, lockdowns and all the bullshit, right? But a lot of people will see Albert Bourla and some people at the top who are pushing for these things and, who make many mistakes, or maybe they could even be corrupt, but they see that they're Jewish and then they say, oh, look at that. It's the Jews, doing this thing. It's the same fallacy. If the Jews, because they tend to be more secular, they're better educated, they move up in the higher echelons of education, of science, of finance and banking, and then they're part of disastrous errors or corruption because we're all equally human. Then it's, again, the low IQ anti-Semites will say, oh, no, it's the Jews and all that. And if really the whole vaccine thing had been some nefarious conspiracy, Israel was one of the most vaxxed countries. They were proud that they used the science to have the first vaccine passport. And I remember, I think Netanyahu even has like the first vaccine they gave in some glass jar because he's so proud of the science and all this nonsense. So again, this is another very popular fallacy. I'm sure people have run into it. Now we're getting close to the end here. Now, calling the Israelis fascist or white capitalist colonizers. This is the standard leftist fallacy, right? The leftist, anything that is not their kumbaya socialist nonsense, they take to call you a fascist, right? This is a very popular fallacy. And, since, especially now that Israel has a lot of pro-capitalism people, they just love to call the Israelis fascists, and so on. And to me, that is a gigantic error. It just arises from the leftist economic ignorance. And this whole thing about white capitalist colonizers, it totally overlooks the real fact that the Jews were escaping anti-Semitism, and it wants to make it all about racism and capitalism. So that's another very popular fallacy. And then the very last one is the whole greater Israel nonsense. And I think just recently Tucker Carlson had a Jewish guy and they were talking about that. And from what I can tell from some of my Israeli friends, I mean, there might be a couple of like very, nationalist Jews, who really do believe in like the greater Israel, some hyper-religious ones that buy into this stuff. But the average Israeli, from as far as I can tell, they would be happy. If they could get a time machine and go in the future 200 years, and there was a Palestinian state and there was peace for 200 years, I'm sure they would go along with even taking all the Jews from the West Bank, So the reason why the Israelis, the way I see things, they keep having to have those wars and expulsions, is because they're trying to protect themselves. They got the rockets coming at them. That's how they see things, and they feel like they'll never have peace. So this whole greater Israel nonsense thing, I think it's just another like fallacy. Okay, so we're done with just looking at the fallacies here. So now, let me get to what I consider to be the Zionist fallacies, right? Now, central to Zionist ideology, okay, is the fallacy that in order to overcome anti-Semitism, which many erroneously see as some irrational hate, the world's oldest, of course, that can't be overcome via reason, education, like all other fallacies like slavery, unequal treatment of women, Jews must abandon the organically evolved and time-tested humble synagogues, cultures, languages, towns, and cities where they had lived with non-Jews for centuries in increasingly peaceful and harmonious ways to create a Jewish state in the most sacred of areas that was overwhelmingly populated by Muslims, Christians, and many Jews who were adamantly opposed to living under a Jewish state. Also, a state with a coerced, atheist, Herzl-designed Jewish flag, anthem, and overall national identity concocted by misguided European ideologues who inherited many of the racist and socialist fallacies of their times. I mean, Theodor Herzl could care less about Judaism. He wanted to solve anti-Semitism by getting all the Jews to convert to Christianity. He didn't circumcise his kids. He was an atheist, Also, David Ben-Gurion, and he also designed the first Israeli flag, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's architect and first prime minister, was an atheist and socialist who eagerly attended Moscow in 1923 to celebrate the 7th anniversary of the Bolsheviks' October Revolution and get a glimpse of his hero, fellow Jew, Lev Davidovich Bronstein Trotsky. Ben Zion Netanyahu, right, Bibi's dad, wrote and believed absurdities like, quote, "If a nation says out of conviction, I am strong and forceful, then it becomes strong and forceful. This is the law of greatness," end quote. Impressive, written in cursive by a 4-year-old, but an absurd basis for creating a country in the most sacred of locations. The point I want to make is that when you really look at these early Zionists, these people were clueless. They were just simple-minded, tribalistic ideologues with their identity and all that stuff. They were very bright. I mean, they were very bright, but again, like Einstein, they fooled themselves into a total disaster. I mean, today when you ask a British, They'll tell you that 200 years ago, their family members who might have fought in the Afghanistan wars, they coerced, Cubans and then, the Indians or whatever. Yeah, they believed they made mistakes. And hopefully we can get the Zionists to see that their intellectual leaders they were not Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard creating a great state. It was just a bunch of ideologues with the fallacies of their times. Very important as well, Zionism did not put any emphasis in overcoming the intellectual errors that led to anti-Semitism. So it could only make them worse. Theodor Herzl, very famously in his diary and in The Jewish State, he writes, "The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries are allies. Great exertions will hardly be necessary to spurn the movement. Anti-Semites provide the requisite impetus. They need only do what they did before, and then they will create a desire to emigrate where it did not previously exist and strengthen it where it existed before." Very important, Zionism at the early days was wisely rejected by most Jews when Herzl began to seriously organize for it. The rabbinical establishment, reflecting the view shared by most Jews in Munich, Germany, where Herzl wanted to have the first Zionist Congress, strongly rejected the idea. So the meeting had to be moved to Basel, Switzerland. They told him, quote, "We comprise a separate community solely with respect to religion. Regarding nationality, we feel totally at one with our fellow Germans and therefore strive towards the realization of the spiritual and moral goals of our dear fatherland with an enthusiasm equaling theirs." Leading Zionists after Herzl's death, Chaim Weizmann, lamented how, quote, "For assimilated Jews, they looked upon it, Zionism, as a primitive tribalism. They felt themselves called upon to rescue Judaism from Zionism. These people are dead against Zionism." So all of these Jews who were integrating into society and they were becoming successful and just living with everyone else and they were becoming secular, the last thing they wanted to do is just work on this identity stuff and go create ourselves a country somewhere else when we're integrating with everyone else. So they were very against Zionism. And also the religious Jews, the Orthodox and those people, those guys detested the Jewish state created by a bunch of these, secular guys, so. Now, socialist identity and morality replaced the previous ones of Russians, Chinese, and Cubans, unfortunately, as it created the socialist man who was to be selfless and enthusiastic in spreading the communist revolution and thus banned the profitable order expanding private sector. They destroyed the very social order that they tried to improve. Similarly, Zionists attempted to engineer a new identity, as leading Zionist Jabotinsky wrote in 1905. "Take the Yid, Jew of today, and try to imagine in our minds his exact opposite. The Yid is ugly, sickly, and lacks handsomeness, and we shall endow the ideal image of the Hebrew, the new Zionist, with masculine beauty. The Yid is disgusting to all." So they wanted to engineer the Jews. And also, just like the socialists, unfortunately, the Zionists created a new, flawed, in my opinion, moral code. Jabotinsky in The Iron Wall, this essay must be read by anyone who cares about this mess. He writes, "We hold that Zionism is moral and just. And since it is moral and just, justice must be done, no matter whether Joseph or Simon or Ivan or Ahmed agree with it or not. There is no other morality." And he also says, culturally, the Arabs, are 500 years behind us. Typical. Now, so Zionists did not overcome anti-Semitism via reason, sympathy for the misguided, and education, which are the only ways to overcome fallacies, and attempted to overcome anti-Semitism via moral pontification, condemnation, vilification, violence, and separation, which could only intensify anti-Semitism. And like the socialists, they compounded the problem by tying their identity and morality to errors required the coercion of thousands in Palestine via their Jewish state, the West and US via the necessary taxation to fund America's now over $1.5 trillion military consumption needed to destroy all of Israel's enemies like Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Iran, and so on. And sadly, hate speech laws that criminalize ideological opposition. CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, mentioned that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and that anti-Zionism is genocide. Israeli author of the great books, The Invention of the Jewish People and The Invention of the Land of Israel, Shlomo Sand, astutely mentioned that, quote, "Zionism has become a sort of Stalinism." So again, Greenblatt. And also, again, since the Zionists put very little effort in actual education, I'm sure a lot of you guys know about this unfortunate period of history, just 7 or 8 months into Hitler getting power in Germany, before there were, before the Second World War, all the calamities, via the Haber Agreement, the Zionists were already collaborating with the Nazis, so, "Oh yeah, you got a problem, you need to get rid of your Jews. Oh, that's okay, we understand, give us the Jews." Now, in Zionist mythology, this means that these people were very bright and they were saving the Jews over the calamity that was going to come. But this was again reflective of the Zionification, of the Jews. Now, this was very controversial. People like Jabotinsky were totally opposed to this. They did not. Jabotinsky wanted to totally destroy the Nazis. Any collaboration with the Nazis was seen as very bad by some. This was very controversial. Now, very important again, just like my own family in Cuba, just like we went from having a certain ideology to having a communist ideology that was an identity that was injurious, the same thing was happening to the Zionists, to the Jews, right? So we have to see how that mindset and new identity, is formed. So here's a perfect example of a Zionist mentality, right? So here we have Samuel Untermyer in August 7th, like maybe 6 months after Hitler, gets in power. So we're ready. Understandably, I get it. Hitler made a lot of mistakes. He was an anti-Semite, but we have to overcome the fallacies through reason and logic. But here we have getting ready for war. We got to destroy these people. So here's what Untermyer, a very popular Zionist Jewish leader, he says, quote, each of you, Jew and Gentile alike, who is not already enlisted in the sacred war should do so now and here. It is not sufficient that you should buy no goods made in Germany. You must refuse to deal with any German merchant or shopkeeper who sells any German-made goods or who patronizes German ships or shipping. We will undermine the Hitler regime and bring the German people to their senses by destroying their export trade on which their very existence depends. Okay, again, we gotta bomb the Iranians to liberate them, to educate them, to show them how evil, these people are. So it's just this mentality that is not focused on intellectual errors. But now let us look at what other Jews were saying. For example, the Orthodox Jews, there were a lot of, Jewish populations that this is the last thing they wanted. They were against the boycott. They wanted to use reason and overcome all the fallacies. So this was what they said in 1935. They had a letter opposing, the forceful boycotts and all the vilifications. And this is what they wrote. They said, regarding the boycott, this is against the principles of our faith, which commands, quote, when you come to your enemy, call him for peace. The aim of the Jewish people is to seek peace under all circumstances. Boycotting a nation may cause the suffering of innocent people, and this surely would not be in the spirit of the teachings of our forefathers. The present German government is doing wrong in persecuting the Jews, and it is the duty of our people to find ways and means to appeal and try to persuade the German government to change its attitude towards them and to prove that the Jew is a good citizen and is ready at all times to protect his country. This was proved in the last war, World War I. Thousands of Jews lost their lives to protect Germany. Therefore, we are against boycott. We suggest that a committee should be appointed to seek direct contact with the German government and settle all matters peacefully. This is the true Jewish spirit. This committee should represent the Orthodox, the Reformed, the conservative Jew. This plan, we are sure, with the help of our Lord, will settle the question of the German Jew and will also bring about goodwill between all Jews and nations of the world. Right? But these people, today, remember, the early Jews were against Zionism. These people today are anti-Semites, right? That's what they are. Okay, so we're done talking about some of these fallacies, some of these Jewish fallacies. In my case, for why I believe Zionism was an intellectual error. So now let us look at how bad things are getting, our modern anti-Semitism, given all the chaos. So once again, the famous quote from Herzl talking about how the anti-Semites will be our more steadfast friends. And here we have what's going on right now. I get it. Anti-Semitism is spreading on all the fallacies. So this might be, Guy, the most important thing you can do to stop this war, the war on Iran, is be openly and vocally anti-Semitic. That's a major fallacy, right? You are just justifying the Zionist error, the way I see it, right? Dan Bilzerian, very famous, the king of Instagram, 30 million followers there, and so on. Very courageous in showing what the effects of Zionism are. There's a lot of things to criticize in the Zionist government and calamity, but it is a huge error to make all kinds of anti-Semitic fallacies. So he says, in one time, he says, we are fighting Jewish greed, plain and simple. That's nonsense. Jewish greed, it's just such an obvious trope. He's replying to John Podhoretz, one of the famous neocons. He says, no more Christians want to die for Jewish greed. Get fucked, you treasonous cunt. Again, for Jewish greed, more fallacies that only grow, the sentiment for the Zionist expansion. And he also says, Jews should pay Holocaust reparations to the families of the 60 million Christians they killed during the Bolshevik genocide. Again, confusing Jewish overrepresentation into this massive calamity as if it was some sinister plot. Major fallacies. This one is scary. I totally understand. Kim.com, a very famous IT guy, 1.7 million followers on Twitter. He ran this poll saying, do you want the Jews kicked out of America? That is scary. And almost 85% of the people said yes. This is awful, right? This is not helping. This is awful. Dan Bilzerian again. I've received a lot of serious threats from powerful Jews saying if I don't stop posting about Israel and the Talmud, I'll be jailed or killed. My answer is fuck you. There's a war going on between good and evil. You will be tested. Again, he's totally overlooking the complex evolution of all the fallacies and the hatreds and simplifying it into just good versus evil. This is just going to lead to more running across the trenches and a total calamity. Now, I put this one because there's some other famous influencers in there like Sam Parker. I really admire the courage of these people. We need to respect the freedom and the courage of people to express how they really see the world so we can understand their fallacies, right? So to me, these people are courageous in many ways. So Sam Parker is another very famous of these people. He says, we're with you all the way. Censorban is another Twitter account that also does a good job of showing a lot of Zionist errors. But again, they mix it in with the anti-Semitism, so it only makes things worse. And Dr. Anastasia Maria Lupis, another, I consider these people courageous. Anyone who has the courage to express how they really see things, I think deserves praise, even though they make errors. So she's another one. Now, Congressman Andy Fine, the opposite, right? One of the most naive, simple-minded American Zionist politicians, disastrous. We need more Islamophobia, not less. Fear of Islam is rational. So we can see the two opposites are just polarizing the whole planet. So he's awful, and he's here in Florida. And Dan Bilzerian replies, the Jewish propaganda never stops with this fat bastard. Notice the hypocrisy when the same is said of his religion. Watch the Jew shriek. Okay. Now, this is very important. Like, again, Jewish propaganda. Again, it's absurd. It makes it seem like the Jews are just plotting to just constantly lie, to do whatever. It would be a lot wiser, I think, to say Zionist mythology. Okay, because I believe that Zionism is a mistake. But it's not the result of some massive Jewish propaganda. Just like communism. One could say that, that communist or socialist mythology fooled a lot of people into making intellectual errors. Also, when you tell someone they're following popular myths, and you're not calling them evil. When you call someone that you're purposely evil, you're already, the people look at themselves. This happened with the communists, right? You're calling a communist evil, and he's like, no, I have good intentions. I want to share the wealth and all that. But if you say somebody's following wrong ideas, then you make it into an intellectual thing, and then you get into dialogue. So no, I'm not following popular myths. This is why I believe, Israeli government is doing good, and so on. But again, we should be talking about mythology, not about conspiracy or malice. E. Michael Jones, a very famous Catholic. Again, I really respect him for his courage to express his views. He knows a lot about the Zionist calamity, but to, again, make it about the Jews is disastrous. Look, pornography, like abortion, is a Jewish sacrament. It should be illegal. And victims like Ryan, some guy that jerked off too much or whatever, should be able to sue the rabbi who owns Pornhub for damages. Again, the fallacies on each side, are leading to the polarizations. Candace, now we get to Candace. She's referring to the bombing in Iran of the school that killed like 150 children. She's saying, it was not a mistake. Israel is required to mass murder children because they worship Baal. Trump does as he is instructed by Jared Kushner and Bibi Netanyahu. I think these are mistakes. She's making a mistake here. Now, very important, but let's look. I mean, Trump has Jared Kushner and Wickoff doing everything. They're supposed to negotiate with Russia. They're negotiating the Gaza thing. He sent it to negotiate the Iranian stuff. I mean, why is it that we have these Zionist Jews be the ones that are trying to manage the world? Is that a result of some grandiose, sinister conspiracy? No. You see, if you look at an ideology like socialism appealed to everyone. You could be a black socialist. You could be a Cuban socialist, a Russian socialist, a Chinese socialist. And that's why we got socialists moving to the top in all these governments of all walks of life. But Zionism, understandably, appeals more to Jews. So it makes sense. It's an ideology that little by little, just because of the necessity, it keeps bubbling up and percolating Jews to higher positions of influence. And that is the reason why we have this. It's not some grandiose, conspiracy. I mean, and sadly, just like at the top of the socialist ideologues, you have a bunch of economically clueless people. That's what we have right now. We just have a bunch of Zionists up there trying to manage society, where they think that, and Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House in the United States, he said, Hezbollah and Hamas are tied with Iran, and they're tied with Russia and China. That is the new axis of evil. Sadly, this is what is polarizing the most naive ideologues, right? That is what creates the foundation for all these polarizations that we're seeing. But again, it's very important to understand, how the ideas that group man, how they slowly arise and how far conspiratorial nonsense. Now here, let me just get back now to give a good example of how the Jews themselves have their, misguided thinkers, to say the least. So this is Rabbi Ovaida Joseph. He was like the leading rabbi of like the Sephardic Jews. He's like the Pope of the Sephardic Jews. And he said, Goyim, non-Jews were born only to serve us. Without that, they have no place in the world, only to serve the people of Israel. Why are Gentiles needed? They will work, they will plow, they will reap. We will sit like an effendi and eat. That is why Gentiles were created. It's awful, obviously, right? His funeral was attended by over 500,000 people, right? I mean, but to me, I have no problem with that. This is just a guy, living in his bubble. But unfortunately, the anti-Semites now look at this and it's like, look what the Jews are doing. So again, we have the lowest common denominator, on both sides, polarizing the whole planet. Okay, so just to recap, so the Zionist fallacies. Number one was Zionism itself as a way to overcome anti-Semitism, coercing this Herzl made-up bullshit identity upon thousands of people was a mistake. That did not overcome anti-Semitism. It only made things worse. Now, there's a couple more I want to throw in here. Number two, especially secular Darwinian-minded Israelis, erroneously think that they are some beacon of Western values and civilization because they're secular, equal rights for women, and all this kind of stuff. And they see themselves surrounded by fanatical, very pissed off Muslims, calling them satanic, doing all these things, and having different norms for women, supposedly being inferior culturally the way they see it, right? And this fools them, into thinking that somehow, oh, Zionism is good, we're advanced, right? But here they're making the exact same error that the Soviets made, right? The Soviets had Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. They had the chess champions, they had the mathematics and all that stuff. And they had the Christians that they were oppressing, calling them satanic and all these bad things. But no matter how much people hated the Soviets, it only fooled them into thinking that they had the superior ideology, yet they had the wrong ideology. And I think the same thing is happening a lot, with a lot of secular Jews, who read Dawkins and Yuval Hariri and the Weinstein brothers and God Saad, all these, and, Wolf. Okay, so I think that is a mistake, to look at all this relative barbarism and to think that automatically you have the right ideas. And the third one, this is a very tricky one. So naively overstating the role that Judaism has played in Western civilization. Western civilization is the result of a complex, emergent, evolved process that has borrowed from tons of cultures, throughout time. The Jews, did not invent a monotheistic God. Even today, we still have Zoroastrianism. I'm sure it's a religion you guys have heard of. They're a small religion, but these guys are even older than Judaism, and they're also monotheistic. The Babylonians, long before the Jews, they were already talking about interest rates and loans and all kinds of things. So, but it's understandable how a lot of Jews, they want to cherry pick and think that somehow, they are, the inventors of civilization. And it's very important to realize that in many ways, the Jews, remember, the Zionists have only wrecked Judaism and modern civilization. Everything that has been good that you could even credit to Judaism was from the pre-Zionist Jews, right? So Zionism, to me, again, it's like communism. It's has been a bad idea. So again, that's a very popular fallacy, and a lot of people like to call this like Jewish supremacy. A lot of them, maybe they think that they're all that, and I have no problem with Jews thinking that they're all that they invented civilization or whatever. I mean, to me, it's just a fallacy, right? They don't know about Menger and Mises and Hayek. Go ahead and think that you're all that. I have no problem with that, but I can see how it creates a certain reaction. So okay, so those are the fallacies. Now, okay, finally, we're getting to the solution. Now, as I talk about the solution, so first thing I want to mention is that the biggest names in free market economics, to me, the biggest, Friedrich Hayek, one of the biggest intellectual giants of all time, okay, and Murray Rothbard were very critical of Zionism. They knew that it was a flawed ideology, a total disaster. So here I have a picture. It's Hayek all the way on the left and Rothbard all the way on the right. Now, in the middle, you have Walter Block, who's a strong supporter of Netanyahu and Zionism. I mean, he hates the Israeli government, but this does not reflect exactly his views. And I'm a buddy with Walter Block. So I want to say a few things about this intellectual giant. So just like major free market intellectuals, 1974 Nobel laureate in economics F.A. Hayek and Murray Rothbard knew that socialism was a failed ideology, they also knew that Zionism, at least the current version that Bibi and most Israelis keep pushing, was disastrous. Rothbard knew that Zionism was disastrous, and he wrote a classic essay called, and I will quote it in a second, called War Guilt in the Middle East, right after the 1967 war, where he already took the whole thing apart. And now Hayek desperately tried to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by interacting with Menachem Begin and sending some letters in the late 70s and early 80s. But like socialist ideologues, he just pretty much got ignored. And eventually Hayek threw in the towel and he wrote a letter to the London Times in May 1985, where he desperately writes the following. He says, quote, I ought to urge publicly what I have vainly urged on Israeli friends many times, namely that Israel could make no greater contribution to the safety of its own future and to the peace of the world by offering Jerusalem as the common capital of a Palestine federation, amounting, at least at first, to little more than a common defense and free trade union. Okay? So that's sort of like what he wanted, and my solution is somewhat inspired by that. So for Hayek's proposal, as mentioned in his second letter to Begin, dated May 2nd of 1980, he says, quote, this is probably the only way in which you can permanently secure to all Jews free access to Jerusalem and probably the right of settlement in all associated federal areas. So he wanted a big trade zone, just like the United States. We have 50 states, but everybody can live anywhere. You can do whatever you want. He sort of envisioned something like that, just free trade, real peace. And he said, so this is also similar to my friend, who I know personally, David Beito's Swiss-style canton system, worth looking as well, the proposed framework. Hayek envisioned an area of free trade and movement, again, settlement in all the associated federal states, that would become, these are his words, quote, one of the greatest financial centers. in a letter to Colic, the mayor of Jerusalem. Now, Murray Rothbard, in his essay written in 1967, this is how he ends the essay. Quote, Israel, therefore, faces a long-run dilemma which she must someday meet, either to continue on her present course and, after years of mutual hostility and conflict, be overthrown by Arab people's guerrilla war, or to change direction drastically, to cut herself loose completely from Western imperial ties and become simply Jewish citizens of the Middle East. If she did that, then peace and harmony and justice would at last reign in that tortured region. There is ample precedent for this peaceful coexistence. For in the centuries before the 19th and 20th centuries and Western imperialism, Jew and Arab had always lived well, peacefully together in the Middle East. There is no inherent enmity or conflict between Arab and Jew. In the great centuries of Arab civilization in North Africa and Spain, Jews took a happy and prominent part, in contrast to their ongoing persecution by the fanatics of the Christian West. Shorn of Western influence and Western imperialism, that harmony can reign once more. Now, it's very, future, it's prescient. It's predicting a lot of what is going on. He's not right, of course, because Israel has managed to persuade the United States to continue $2 trillion in military spending. Israel can still, fight all these battles and so on. But in many ways, we're in a race against time, right? Sooner or later, it'll become possible for any disgruntled person to create something like a nuke. We already have the Houthis who hardly have any technology sending ballistic missiles into Israel, right? We have to solve this mess, and so anyway, I thought it's an incredible essay. I highly recommend people read it. Sorry about this. Okay, so now we're almost done. Now there's going to be a little movie that is going to play, and it's going to be about 15 minutes. That's going to say a little more and start talking about the actual concrete steps of the solution. I will pause it before it finishes because some things I want to mention myself.
Next we discuss a one-state solution where everyone has equal rights, lives in peace, and can quickly become a beacon of economic education and resulting prosperity not just for everyone in the area but the whole world. Let us begin by quoting Mises again.
Liberalism is rationalistic. It maintains that it is possible to convince the immense majority that peaceful cooperation within the framework of society better serves their rightly understood interests than mutual battling and social disintegration. It has full confidence in man's reason. It may be that this optimism is unfounded and that the liberals have erred. But then there is no hope left for mankind's future.
To Mises and his intellectual disciples, we either believe that we can succeed in educating the immense majority and thus act accordingly, or there is no hope left for mankind's future. The same applies to our Jew-Gentile misunderstandings and Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If we do not have enough people who believe that we can educate the immense majority about the numerous fallacies which underpin the chaos and see a prosperous future and act accordingly, then there is no hope left for mankind's future. Free market intellectuals are the only people in the world who truly understand how freedom is the only way we will solve this mess. Here we have Palestinian-born economist Saifedean Ammous, who is arguably the most impactful free market economist alive, and author of the sort of Bible of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general, The Bitcoin Standard, The Decentralized Alternative to Central Banking, a book that nearly 7 years after initial publication continues to dominate numerous bestseller categories, discussing the need and feasibility of a one-state solution.
I grew up in Ramallah, and when I was a kid, I threw rocks at Israeli soldiers, and I saw one of my friends get shot in front of me. He lost his eye. I've gone through that. I've gone through this experience of really living the conflict very vividly. I've had cousins killed. I've seen all kinds of things happen. I've seen houses demolished. I've seen lands get stolen. And I've managed to come to the conclusion that really the only way out of this is a one-state solution, is just to move away from this notion that we need to move away from this completely destructive idea that it's us versus them, it's them versus us, it's either us or them. We have to drive them into the sea, or they're going to drive us into the sea, one or the other. And it's unfortunately becoming more and more predominant. So I spent, after I went to university, I developed this idea that no, I think the only way out of this is to just have a state with everybody there. And I still think of this as the solution. I think I don't want to kick anybody out of their home, even Israeli settlers in the West Bank. I don't think that it would be just, most people in the West, when they say, well, I support the creation of a Palestinian state in West Bank and Gaza, but obviously the Palestinians reject it. No, you don't. Like, you think you do because you watch TV and you just repeat the stupid things that your TV tells you to repeat. But do you support almost a million Israelis now in the West Bank and East Jerusalem? Do you support kicking them out of their homes? Many of them have been there for decades. Do you really support them? Do you really think this is a realistic possibility? Do you think the Israeli government is just going to one day say, all right, time's up, let's give the West Bank to the Palestinians, give them a state over the West Bank, and we're going to make 1 million Jewish refugees move from the West Bank to Palestine? It's not going to happen in any kind of meaningful way. There's no way that Israel's going to do that or accept it. It's politically impossible. It's politically suicidal. And also, I don't believe that these notions of international law are sacrosanct. I don't want to kick people out of their homes. I think if we do this, it's not going to be a solution. So it's only going to make things worse. So for me, what I would view as the solution is very simple. Everybody stay where they are, and everybody gets to live there, and we just move toward the libertarian order in which property is free. Anybody can own property, anybody can buy, anybody can sell, and we separate ethnicity from property rights. So you can have your property regardless of what religion you're in, and the government isn't out there maintaining property only for one religion. And I think that would also include right of return for Palestinians who were expelled in 1948. And this is something that I've believed for quite a while.
Here we have Israeli-born and great free market author and evangelist, Yaron Brook, wisely recognizing how if we had real freedom, we should not even have a Zionist state, and also making the vital case for the prerequisite economic education, something both Yaron and Seyfeddin are in complete agreement with.
You know, I don't consider myself a Zionist. Like in an ideal world, in my view, there would be no Israel.
My question is this: how, given all of this confused, bloody, chaotic history, what can we actually do here and now to start moving the world away from those endless cycles of blood feuds and towards one that we all three share in idealized form, right? A world that actually universally respects life, liberty, and property. 5 minutes to Safe, I guess you would be first this time, or Yaron, either one of you guys want to take it.
Happy to go first. Whatever you want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say we have to educate people about individualism, about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's no shortcuts in the world, and this is, I agree with Mises' quote 100%. I think it's absolutely right. And the way to achieve peace is to bring about liberty and freedom, to bring about individualism, the caring about individual rights, and that would eradicate anti-Semitism, which of course would, do away with the need for a particular state that allowed Jews to emigrate to because they could go anywhere. Freedom would be fantastic. Freedom is the solution. But the only way to do that, there are no shortcuts here, is to educate people about freedom, to educate people about Mises. And the way to get there is through education. I don't see a shortcut. Politics is not the solution. It's all about educating people about these ideas.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think I agree with everything that Yaron said.
The goal will be the replacement of the current flawed Zionist government entity for a modern free market state where everyone will have real freedom, equal rights, and skyrocketing socio-economic advancement. Name and flag can be determined in some future time but should obviously not single out or exclude any group of people. I'll call it the Holy Land for now. The solution will be introduced in 2 steps. First, we will describe what the final state will look like, some of the problems it will overcome, various benefits, and a few remarks regarding the feasibility of everyone living together, especially given the increasing polarizations due to the Israeli-Hamas war. Second, we will discuss a few steps to transition from our current state with its Israeli-Hamas war and ramifications to this final one state. Overcoming Zionism and related chaos should be done via a one-state solution that properly ends the misguided ideology. Any Zionist state, no matter how small, as long as it coerces a foreign religion, anthem, flag on Palestinians should be seen as unnecessary and somewhat immoral, and the product of bygone years when we were understandably less civilized, similarly to how we see the former British Empire or slavery. Any Zionist state reaffirms the insulting erroneous fallacy and slap to Darwin that is at the core of Zionism that says that some Homo sapiens are the good and civilized Homo sapiens who must live apart from the bad and evil Homo sapiens. No self-respecting Muslim who really believes in God, in the moral duty to support what is just and fight what is unjust, and knows the history of Zionism, and its numerous fallacies will understandably tolerate the Zionist fallacies and state. What they will do is forgive with compassion, just like we can likewise expect the Homo sapiens who have absorbed a Jewish identity to forgive the naive anti-Semites who just made understandable mistakes. If with countless restrictions, organizations like Hamas can arise and launch rockets, allowing a Palestinian state right next door which may easily acquire even deadlier weapons is an understandable fear and risk that Zionists are not willing to take. As Netanyahu wisely explains, every area that we evacuate we've received terrible terror against us. It happened in South Lebanon, in Gaza, also today in Samaria, and therefore I clarify that, any other arrangement in the future, the state of Israel has to control the entire area from the river to the sea. This truth I say to our American friends, and I also stop the attempt to impose on us a reality that will jeopardize us. A prime minister in Israel has to be able to say no, even to the best of friends. To say no when you need to and to say yes when you can. Technology is making it increasingly easy for small groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis to develop deadlier and more sophisticated weapons. And likewise, the Israeli Zionist ideology has better ways to spy on the whole planet, and likewise silence and kill its critics. It is absurdly obvious how this process can only end in a final world war-like calamity. Thus a one-state solution. Just like anti-Semitism, is an intellectual error to be overcome via reason, logic and education instead of force via hate speech laws, or separation via Zionism, Zionism too is an intellectual error to be overcome likewise and not via armed resistance. The Soviet Union and underlying socialist myths were ultimately overcome not in some great war, but by helping enough socialists themselves overcome their fallacies. If Russia, a relatively modern free market economy where over 50% of its population is employed in the private sector by over 3 million private sector businesses, is now led by Putin, a former KGB agent whose job at one time was to help enforce socialist myth, why should we not have faith that a likewise naive and dangerously Zionized Mossad agent today may be a future leader in the area? Again, violence does nothing to overcome the underlying fallacies that lead to conflicts, whether the fallacies are anti-Semitic or Zionist ones. Per Mises, we must focus on the ideas and overcome the fallacies which then lead to the hatreds, polarizations, and wars. And similarly we must look at history trying to understand how people fooled themselves into disastrous ideologies instead of just making condemnations. Decades of armed resistance towards Zionism has only fueled Zionist fallacies and power, leading us to where we are today, with the Middle East and especially Gaza totally destroyed due to Zionist military interventions, American economic prosperity and future bankrupted by yearly over $1 trillion military budgets and related debt and inflation used to finance Zionist-inspired wars, European culture and stability destroyed by millions of Muslim refugees poorly integrated into economically naive European welfare states, Zionist ideologues in more positions of power and influence in the West than ever before, spreading more Zionist clash of civilizations, or there is something intrinsically wrong with Islam myths leading to more Zionist-related polarizations and chaos, and of course, the destruction of freedom of speech throughout Europe and the US. Before even discussing the actual details, any solution will need to find various Gorbachevs or Deng Xiaopings, in other words, respected leaders who can admit that their respective populations have made mistakes which have contributed to the problems.
Hi, Larry.
Hi.
President Gorbachev, I'm honored to talk to you. Do you believe that communism as a political philosophy and a system has still something to offer to the world?
I think that in principle, as a system, as a philosophy, as a model of organizing a society, of reforming society, has to be rejected based on our experience, the experience of our country and of Eastern European countries.
First we need Israeli Zionist leaders who can admit that Zionism, as with Soviet and Maoist communism, had been an understandable error. Just like the communists continued to wreck their economies as their various central plans failed, so have the Zionists and their Zionized American politicians increased the chaos, suffering, and expanding worldwide censorship, tyranny and polarizations as they keep pushing the flawed ideology. One of these potential Zionist Gorbachevs is Yaakov Sheret, who comes from Zionist royalty, being the son of Israeli Prime Minister Moshe Sheret, and has impeccable Zionist credentials, having served in the Palmach State Military Unit, the Jewish Brigade in the British Army during World War II, the Israel Security Agency, Shin Bet, and more. Yaakov is well aware of the monumental error and calamity that Zionism has been. In a Haaretz interview published in September 19, 2021, he mentions,
"In the end, Israel is a country occupying and abusing another people. As opposed to the false mantra, I have no other country, the facts show that there are other countries. There is more than one land. Over 1 million Israelis live abroad. The ideological Zionist commitment evaporates the more the generations pass. People understand that there are better places where to raise children and live. Everywhere has problems, life itself is a problem, but Israel has existential problems. Suddenly people say, we know what needs to be done, for everyone, and are prepared to force their ideas on the public. Who put you in charge? The moment Zionism called for the Jews to immigrate to Israel, in order to establish here one home for the Jewish people, which will be a sovereign state, a conflict was created. The Zionist idea was to come to a place where there were people, members of another religion, completely different. Have you seen anywhere in the world where the majority would agree to give in to a foreign invader, who says, our forefathers were here, and demands to enter the land and take control? The conflict was inherent and Zionism denied this, ignored it. So violent conflict began, and war and another war and another war. If Israel is not okay, I'm not okay either, as someone who pays taxes here. For a certain period there was great hope here that something new had been created. I was a part of that. But now, Zionism, from my point of view, has disappeared. All the promises we made disappeared. I am not comfortable with this. Our national agenda is blood, death and violence. Israel lives on the sword and sharpens it. I am completely alienated from this. I'm also disappointed in the character of the state. When I see the Prime Minister with a kippah on his head, I don't feel good. This is not the Israel I want to see. How did it happen that this new place, that was to have brought innovations, became the blackest place, controlled by the nationalist ultra-Orthodox? How is it that here of all places, there's reactionism and zealotry, messianism, the desire to expand and control another people?
Prosperity for Homo sapiens, regardless of what identity they have absorbed, comes from freedom, free markets, etc. Not having some state that discriminates based on such identity, especially one founded by economically clueless ideologues and the massive displacement of over 700,000 people. Shit happens. Again, the smart atheist Soviets and their countless great scientists and mathematicians and chess players fucked up big, and so did the Chinese. Economic ignorance likewise misled many Jews into preaching for Zionism instead of economic freedom. We also need Islamic leaders to admit how their at times conspiratorial and other misguided and unsympathetic remarks about Jews have been contributors to Zionist fallacies. The Holy Land will be a modern free market state where the central government should be minimal in the sense that it should only be involved in protecting private property and should clearly be forbidden from ever going into education, elderly care, any kind of socialized medicine, etc. This is not up to democratic change and is important so that Jews will not fear a larger Muslim population eventually taking their freedom's wealth, which would definitely be the case if they were forced to pay for massive public sector welfare state bureaucracies attempting to provide equal access funding for education, health services, elderly care, etc. that the economically ignorant though well-intentioned public always falls for. Free marketeers know that democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49. Thomas Jefferson. It is not democracy that brings prosperity, it is the competitive knowledge discovery that arises from private property and thus freedom. The voluntarist constitution provides a great foundation for such a legal structure. Jews and Muslims and Christians, everyone, will have the obvious freedom to pool their wealth to create their own privately funded educational systems, charities, and be free to discriminate if they so wish based on religion, sex, whatever their customs or free individuals agree upon. Palestinians who were expelled during various wars and their descendants will obviously have the right to go back to the lands they were expelled from. If the lands have since been developed, a simple starting solution to the potential conflicts and a way to provide some restitution to the Palestinians and help get this new country on a rapid path to amazing prosperity is as follows. Jews keep all lands and homes and buildings they currently have developed and are clearly being used for productive purposes, even the settlements in the West Bank. Then we take the other land, including the south which is currently mostly desert, and using some simple software we distribute it to all Palestinians and their descendants, who were dispossessed, thus privatizing most of the country. A similar effort should be made so that Jews who were expelled from European and Muslim countries can regain their lost property. So far this simple framework accomplishes the following. Jews should be pretty happy, no fear of a demographic majority that can then interfere with your freedom and/or property, no need to pay for the education of non-Jews or other Jews for that matter, freedom from the bloated, competition-immune and prosperity-destroying Israeli state which treated its citizens like lab rats during COVID mania. No draconian uprooting or potentially economically devastating disruptions. Palestinians regain their freedom and land. Since this minimal state will have minimal taxes or regulations, it will quickly blossom in prosperity. Foreign investment will rush into the country to hire Palestinians, competition between them for their labor will quickly increase their pay wealth. The land will quickly increase in value, providing much deserved compensation for the Palestinians. Eilat, Israel's most southern city, is less than 4 hours from Jerusalem. I'm estimating each Palestinian over 18 will get over an acre of land close to Jerusalem in a country that will soon skyrocket in socio-economic prosperity, and serve as an example beacon of progress. In just 30 years Dubai went from sparsely populated desert to modern metropolis. New Palestine, with its even freer and thus more competitive and productive future economy, proximity to already advanced social order via Israeli companies who themselves will accelerate their own advancement by being free of the bloated Israeli state, proximity to other major cities like Cairo and Damascus, all now easily integrated with peace and unhampered commerce, will likely surpass Dubai-like prosperity in less than 5 years. Next, a few thoughts regarding the feasibility of this proposal. As things are today, over 20% of Israelis are Arabs. So Jews and Arabs already getting along in a single state already happens relatively peacefully, and even with all the errors associated with current Zionist state like having a flag and national anthem that represents people whose grandparents, Jews, expelled the family members and coreligionists of 20% of its population. The above suggested changes will only make it even easier to get along. Initially those whose identities fear distrust each other the most will just live in more segregated parts of the country and neighborhoods, just like happens in the USA with states, cities, and neighborhoods with higher proportions of various groups like blacks, Asians, Hispanics, etc. In the USA there are no black or Hispanic or white militias attacking each other, and the same would occur in this new country. Blacks were once slaves with an understandable hatred of whites, yet freedom and emerging truths that we all are just fellow Homo sapiens has arenas full of mostly white people paying to see mostly black basketball players. This proposed solution first involves transforming the current Israeli state into a new modern free market state free of the Zionist fallacies and injustices, and then giving equal rights to everyone in Gaza and the West Bank and incorporating those areas into the new country. Smaller governing areas based on geographical location similar to the cantons in Switzerland will further provide additional freedom to tailor various rules according to local populations. Next we discuss further details of
All right, guys, we're almost done, and then you guys can go after me. Now I just want to finish like the real steps, the transition steps, to really make this happen as I sort of envision it, and that I think takes care of some of the fears that a lot of people have. So on day one, so we rename the current Israeli state. We renamed the current Israeli state to something like New Palestine. Friedrich Hayek wanted to call it the Levantine Federation, the old Levant. It's an area that is a little bigger, and it could then include parts of Syria and so on in a big free trade zone. So whatever, you know what I mean. We rename it to something like New Palestine or whatever. Everyone gets citizenship. However, we have two zones, right? Zone A is current Israel, and Zone B is the West Bank and Gaza. Now, number two, all Palestinian prisoners are released. All restrictions on occupations in the West Bank and Gaza, Zone B, are ended. Hamas and Iran and the entire Islamic world will have no need for any armed resistance since the occupation has ended, and so has the current Zionist state, as at least how it sort of works. We quickly begin to privatize immediately and deregulate. All government-owned assets are related to education, healthcare, etc., are sold to the highest bidders for gold, okay, which was the pre-Zionism money and will become the official money of the government and related taxes and so on. The IDF is defunded, disbanded, but Jews obviously remain free to keep their arms and so on. Taxes are drastically cut. The transition can take about 3 months, and we can have a separate paper for how to privatize a country quickly. Then, step number 4, all females and males under perhaps 14 years old and men above 50 years old and all men with children, essentially everyone who is not a single military-aged male living in Zone B, are free to travel into Zone A, into the whole country. They can return to their property if available, or get their plot of parceled land. So this algorithm for dividing up the land, it would be a smarter algorithm. If you're close to the beach, you'll get a smarter plot of land. And if you're getting some Negev desert, you get a big chunk of land to make it more equitable. Number 5, we're almost done. Every day, perhaps 1% of the remaining military-age male population, maybe 1% of 700,000 males that would remain in Gaza and the West Bank, is about 7,000 people, from Zone B's, is also given access to Zone A and their land. My guess is that after 1 month, things will go so smoothly that we can just give everyone, access to Zone A and kumbaya, okay? World peace ensues. Keep in mind that during this transition, this is very important, during this transition, with the rest of New Palestine, these men will have freedom within Zone B. They will be able to free to travel to Egypt, to Syria, to Jordan, anywhere. So their prosperity will already start skyrocketing immediately.
6. We place a 20 feet solid gold statue of Ludwig von Mises in front of the Western Wall to constantly create interest and admiration for the man who has likely done the most in the recent past to save the Jews and all of mankind from the economic ignorance which underpins most of our problems. And let us also rename Ben Gurion Airport to Murray N. Rothbard Airport while we are at this sort of thing. The very mention by a few prominent Israeli and Islamic leaders that we will begin to work towards a solution along the above lines, as well as getting a few major Muslim and Jewish athletes or influencers, will greatly increase the feasibility of a proposal along these lines, persuade people, and reverse the polarizations and direction towards the final world war. Loudly clamoring for a solution along these lines brings us free marketeers tremendous advantages. We will be the only ones actually making noise and bringing attention to a rather simple, and thus easy to spread viral plan. It gives us an opportunity to teach and sort of piggyback basic economics as we explain to people how prosperity will skyrocket, helping us in our more ambitious worldwide free market educational efforts, which is obviously the key to everything. Naive thinkers may find such a rapid free market intellectual transformation impossible, but this is precisely what Javier Milei is achieving in Argentina right before our very eyes. To these ignorant naysayers we must say,
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Javier Milei is already treated like a savior Moses by top Zionist leadership. They are intellectually ready for a free market one-state solution. And their desire to annex more land only makes the one-state solution easier to implement. While at this, the Russia-Ukraine war can be quickly solved in a similar manner. Just create a new similarly very low-tax country, or countries, where the free people will be neither ruled by the Russian or Ukrainian bureaucracies. It is that simple. The key is, of course, the proper understanding of economics and a blame-free sympathetic approach to our problems, which blames understandable economic ignorance, misunderstandings, and our tribal human nature as the source of our problems, instead of getting too deep into the good versus evil moral sphere, whereas Mises tells us, no social cooperation is possible where such an attitude prevails. Unfortunately, as already discussed, the Russia-Ukraine war is to a significant degree yet another outgrowth of Jew-Gentile coevolution and misunderstandings, so we have to solve that mess first.
So I just need 2 more minutes. So the only real adults in the room, the people who have the necessary wisdom, to persuade the planet of the feasibility of something along these lines are free market intellectuals. Thus, a vital part of this framework is some organization led by Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and secular free market intellectuals that can become intellectual beacons needed to educate their respective populations. The following list of free market intellectuals can easily become major contributors to such a beacon. Palestinian Muslim economist Saifuddin Amos, which we saw earlier, Palestinian parents, Christian, former US Congressman Justin Amash, Palestinian Muslim Imad ad-Din Ahmad, the founder of the Minaret of Freedom Institute, Turkish Muslim journalist and author Mustafa Akyol, Turkish American economist, political scientist Timur Koran, Israeli writer Yaron Brook, who we saw earlier, who is also the chairman of the board of the Ayn Rand Institute. We would essentially be finally catching up to Hayek and Mary Rothbard regarding Zionism. It is painful to disregard and disagree with monumental intellectual giants who were ahead of their times, like Hayek and Rothbard. We are already caught up to them regarding socialism, and perhaps we can finally do the same regarding Zionism. And last thing, I am one of the many people who is a victim of the Zionized mob. Okay, the bots and this Stop Anti-Semites organization, they tried to get me fired from my previous job. Luckily, I wasn't even working there anymore. They just made up stuff. Like, I have never ever said that the POTUS is controlled by the Jews, or denying the 10/7 atrocities, or saying that all reports of anti-Semitism is fake. So this is just to show, how the mob, the respective mobs are going. So, final slide. No, a few very key quotes. Okay. People will forgive you for being wrong, but they will never forgive you for being right, especially if events prove you right while proving them wrong. I could be wrong, but this is a great quote by Thomas Sowell, free market economist. Quote, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." Upton Sinclair. There's big resistance to change. "It is human nature that repeats itself, not history." John Toland. Quote, Mises. "Most of the tyrants, despots, and dictators are sincerely convinced that their rule is beneficial for the people, that theirs is government for the people." And one of the last ones, Daniel Dennett, "There's simply no polite way to tell people that they've dedicated their lives to an illusion." This definitely applies to communists. I could be wrong about Zionism. And the very final one, people like myself and my like-minded buddies, Machiavelli says, quote, "It ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things, because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new." So, done. Okay. All right. Now you guys can come after me here.